Slip resistance issues regarding building code. What is the most important thing when it comes to construction? Safety. Safety is a condition of being safe from undergoing or causing hurt, injury, or loss. There's two ways that it must be viewed. One way is in the terms of actually managing the project. It is the project managers and superintendents that have to stress safety. The other way that it must be viewed is in the eyes of the client and their everyday life. Being able to think about everyday situations can truly help prevent a lot of accidents from happening later on in the future. For this exact reason and many more, that is why there is a building code that must be followed. If the codes aren't followed correctly, there can be an accident waiting to happen. There are thousands of codes that are set in place to make sure that any building created is safe and meets all the requirements. Nowadays, there are a bunch of different materials to choose from to satisfy code, but something that must be kept in mind for the safety of the building residents or guests is slip resistance. What is slip resistance? See, there are a number of codes that require slip-resistant flooring, whether it be on the pool deck or in the main lobby. The slip-resistant surface might change accordingly. It is nearly impossible to test all real-world situations regarding slip resistance, and in many situations it is a combination of a few things that can lead to slipping, such as the shoes someone wears or if they stepped on a rag. The possibilities are almost endless. Slip resistance and slip-resistant flooring are two completely different things that shouldn't be mixed up. The slip resistance is the relative force that resists the tendency of the shoe or foot to slide along the walkway surface. Slip resistance is related to a combination of factors including the walkway surface, the footwear bottom, and the presence of foreign materials between them. Slip resistance is all about physics, and like previously mentioned, it is almost impossible to test every single situation. Nonetheless, slip resistance is what actually gets measured using a number of different instruments. When something is slip resistant, it is the provision of adequate slip resistance to reduce the likelihood of slip for pedestrians using reasonable care on the walking surface under expected use conditions. See, these definitions clearly identify the differences between the two terms. One is talking about the different factors affecting slip resistance, while the other is merely stating that anything that is slip resistant should be safe to walk on under normal conditions, such as if it were wet. What affects slip resistance? The physics of slip resistance has everything to do with the coefficient of traction. The coefficient of friction is how we measure the floor's slip resistance under certain situations, such as if the floor were wet or dry. While the coefficient of friction can measure the slip resistance of the floor, the probability that someone will slip on the floor is unpredictable due to the many things that can interfere with the floor. There are many factors that affect the possibility of slip occurring on a surface, including by way of example, but not in limitation, the following: the material of the shoe sole and the degree of its wear, the presence and nature of surface contaminants, the speed and length of stride at the time of slip, the physical and mental condition of the individual at the time of slip, whether the floor is flat or inclined, how the hard surface flooring material is used and maintained, and the coefficient of friction of the material, how the flooring surface is structured, and how drainage takes place if liquids are involved. There are only so many things that can be tested in the lab to determine whether or not the floor is slip resistant, and the vast number of things to consider, such as the shoe sole's degree of wear, is that of which cannot be tested. Whether a surface is slippery or not is different from predicting whether or not a person is going to fall and how they're going to fall. Instruments used to measure slip resistance. The test that is conducted is done by the BOT 3000E. This device is a sled-type meter, which means that it crawls along the floor under its own power at a constant speed, measuring the resistance to slip of the standardized piece of rubber loaded into the bottom of the machine. It crawls on the floor, then the user needs to rotate the device 180 degrees and repeat the process and take an average. The device is portable, very easy to use, and prints out the results right then and there. However, there are a few things to note. Nowadays, there are many shoes that use different material than rubber, which is the standard. And this device doesn't work on everyday things such as soap, grease, or oil. On a positive note, the device measures the static and dynamic coefficient of friction. And a lot of the times when measuring both on the same surface or material, the static coefficient of friction is greater than that of the dynamic. Even though the BOT 3000E is electronic, it is still able to measure both dry and wet conditions, making it a very cost-effective tool in the field. There is also the pendulum tester that is made to measure the dynamic coefficient of friction, and it is primarily used to determine situation-like instances, such as a child running on the pool deck. The last device that is used to test the dynamic coefficient of friction is called the tortoise. It's very similar to the BOT3000E, and just like it, produces results quick. After receiving the results from the test conducted, someone needs to make sure that the calculations are meeting the recommended criteria. The recommended criteria, according to the American National Standards Institute, is as follows. Number 1. The hard surface flooring material suitable for level 1 interior spaces expected to be walked upon when wet with water shall have a wet dynamic coefficient of friction of 0.42 or greater. Number 2. When testing using SBR sensor material and SLS solutions as per the procedure in this standard, hard surface flooring materials with a wet dynamic coefficient of friction of less than 0.42, including by way of example but not a limitation, polished surfaces, shall only be installed when the surface will be kept dry. And number 3. Surfaces not intended to be walked upon when wet shall have a dry dynamic coefficient of friction of 0.42 or greater. These are all merely recommendations. It seems a bit ridiculous as to why they're only recommendations, but it's because not all buildings or specific areas require that. In fact, it can actually be worse in some cases to have slip-resistant flooring. For example, in a nursing home, when the floor is kept dry at all times, it needs a small dynamic coefficient of friction to allow for older people to slide their feet. Had the floor been slip-resistant, it could potentially cause them to trip or fall. Issues with the 2017 Florida Building Code. In the 2017 Florida Building Code, there are a number of codes that specify something to be slip-resistant. For example, 1012.7.1 Ramp Surface. The surface of ramps shall be of slip-resistant materials that are securely attached. It seems straightforward enough, but it isn't. The issue with this is the room to interpret what seems fit for the ramp that needs slip resistance. In reality, there are many things to take into account for slip-resistant ramps: the weight of the person, material or soles or wheels, how steep is the ramp, and whether it is outside. The truth is, these things are things that need to be recorded and researched. There shouldn't just be recommendations, there should be rules for slip-resistant flooring based on the type of floor and other things that might affect it. Another great example has to do with Building Code 454.1.3.1.1. Pool wet decks shall be constructed of concrete or other non-absorbent material having a smooth slip-resistant finish. Wet deck areas finishes shall be designed for such use and shall be installed in accordance with the manufacturer's specifications. Wooden decks and walkways are prohibited. The code clearly identifies that it must be installed in accordance with the manufacturer's specifications, leaving no room for error in using any other chemicals that isn't specified for that flooring. However, the issue is that while yes, it might be built to code and have a minimum standard, there should be standards to incorporate hypothetical situations, such as if a mother was to take a conditioner bottle and put it in the kid's hair after the pool. Now, if there's conditioner on the floor, it is going to make the floor extremely slippery, which can be really bad. Something that happens quite often are people who are suing companies for slip and fall accidents, and there can be many reasons why. It all comes down to flooring, though. In this specific case, a woman by the name of Jessie fell out of Publix and got seriously injured. What happened? There was water, and she slipped. She won the case, and the judge deemed that it wasn't her fault she fell. In reality, Publix should have had a sign or cleaned it up, but they shouldn't have had happened in the first place. Publix is obviously going to have a lot of traffic, and in heavily populated grocery stores, there are bound to be many accidents involving liquids. Not to mention, it rains a lot in Florida, and there are hundreds of people walking around with wet shoes. While it is difficult to implement slip-resistant flooring that satisfies all oil, detergent, and chemical spills It takes no effort to take that into consideration and get flooring with a higher dynamic coefficient of friction. The building code in Florida should have regulations on what type of flooring should be used and where. This issue is common to continue to let it slide. As mentioned earlier, safety is the most important thing when under construction and after when everyone will be using the building. The issue with the 2017 Florida Building Code is that there aren't any enforced slip-resistant criteria that the floor must meet. There are only certain criteria that is recommended. However, it is possible to get an understanding using all of the testing methods and replicating different scenarios. As an owner, it is in their best interest to have the nicest slip-resistant flooring that exceeds that of the recommendations due to legal reasons. Even though there are way too many specific instances that can occur and it's impossible to test them all, it isn't hard to get a good understanding of what will be slip resistant in everyday situations. The safety of many people is at stake the longer slip resistance criteria remains recommended. There needs to be more enforcement, and real life situations must be researched to progress into the future safely.